National Museum of African American History and Culture houses extensive documentation of formerly enslaved people who achieved remarkable success during Reconstruction. But few stories are as dramatic as those involving individuals who not only gained freedom, but actually acquired property from their former enslavers, creating complete reversals of the master-slave relationship. On a morning in September 2025, historian Dr. Angela Davis opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most extraordinary stories of Reconstruction-era success she has encountered. The case of a woman named Rebecca, who was born enslaved in Georgia in 1845, who had vitiligo that caused distinctive patches of depigmentation across her face and body, who because of her appearance was assigned to household work rather than field labor, who secretly learned to read by observing the enslavers' children's lessons, who after emancipation worked for wages and saved money while carefully studying her former enslavers' failing finances, and who in 1870, just 5 years after freedom, purchased 200 acres, including the main house of the plantation where she had been enslaved, becoming the owner of land and property that had once belonged to the man who had owned her as property, one of the most complete documented reversals of power from the Reconstruction era. The donation comes from a historical society in Georgia that has been researching property transfers during Reconstruction and the remarkable stories of formerly enslaved people who acquired land. The letter explains that while examining property records from the late 1860s, early 1870s, researchers discovered documentation of Rebecca's purchase of her former enslaver's plantation, along with her testimony given in 1875, explaining how she achieved this extraordinary acquisition. Angela carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled as a late 1800s portrait, with a stark clarity typical of early studio plates. It features a young black woman seated in front of a paneled wall, lit by strong window light falling from the right, creating sharp geometric shadows, while bathing her face and hands in soft natural light. Her expression is calm but unreadable, not fearful, not hopeful, simply steady. She wears a dark, modest dress with a white rounded collar and a single button at the neckline. Her posture is composed, arms folded gently across her lap. What makes the image immediately striking is the pattern of vitiligo across her face, neck, and hands, pale patches forming stark contrast against her natural skin tone. The markings are irregular, but symmetrical enough to draw attention to her eyes, which hold directly on the camera. They give the sense of someone used to being looked at, but not defined by the gaze. The quiet composition, the clean lines of the wall, the simplicity of her dress, the soft daylight, creates a portrait that feels intimate, dignified, and haunting in its stillness. Angela turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Rebecca Freeman, photographed Georgia, 1875, born enslaved 1845 on Morrison Plantation, has vitiligo, which led to her assignment as house servant rather than field worker. Secretly learned to read by observing enslavers' children's lessons. After emancipation in 1865, worked for wages, saved money, and studied Morrison's finances. In 1870, purchased 200 acres, including the main house of Morrison Plantation, for $800 when Morrison faced bankruptcy. Became one of the few formerly enslaved people to own the plantation where they had been enslaved. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, she was born enslaved on the Morrison Plantation. Her vitiligo made her different, which paradoxically gave her opportunities, household work instead of field labor, proximity to education, knowledge of the family's business. She used every advantage, learned everything she could, and when freedom came, she was ready. 5 years after emancipation, she owned the plantation. The man who had owned her as property now lived as a tenant on land she owned. The reversal was complete. Angela reads the inscription 3 times, her heart racing. Rebecca had been enslaved on the Morrison plantation, had used the opportunities her vitiligo inadvertently provided to gain knowledge and skills, and after emancipation had systematically worked to acquire the plantation itself. Within 5 years of freedom, she had achieved one of the most complete reversals of power imaginable, owning the land and home of the man who had once owned her. Angela spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds is extraordinary. Property records documenting Rebecca's purchase of 200 acres from James Morrison in 1870. Financial records showing how she accumulated the purchase price. Testimony from Rebecca given in 1875, explaining her strategy and reflecting on owning the plantation where she had been enslaved, and documentation of how she successfully managed the property for decades after acquisition. From Rebecca's testimony, given in Atlanta in June 1875, "My name is Rebecca Freeman. I chose the name Freeman after emancipation because it represents the freedom I gained in 1865 and the economic independence I achieved in 1870 when I purchased the Morrison plantation, where I had been enslaved. I was born enslaved on the Morrison plantation in Georgia in 1845. I was born with a condition that causes patches of my skin to lose color. I later learned this is called vitiligo. From early childhood, my skin had these distinctive markings that made me look different from other enslaved people. Having vitiligo was difficult in some ways. People stared at me. Some thought I was cursed or marked by God. Children were sometimes afraid of me. But paradoxically, having vitiligo also created opportunities that other enslaved people didn't have. Because of my distinctive appearance, Mrs. Morrison, the enslaver's wife, decided I should work in the house rather than in the fields. She said I would be more suitable for household work. I don't know exactly why she made this decision. Perhaps she thought my appearance made me less threatening, or perhaps she found my appearance interesting in some way. Working in the house rather than in the fields was an enormous advantage. House servants worked hard, but the work was less physically brutal than field labor. House servants also had access to knowledge that field workers didn't have. We heard conversations, we observed how the household functioned, we learned about the family's business and finances. Most importantly for me, working in the house gave me access to education, though not in any way the Morrisons intended or knew about. The Morrison children had a tutor who came to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. I was expected to be present during lessons to serve water, manage the room, and handle various tasks. I was supposed to be invisible, just part of the furniture. But I wasn't invisible to myself. I watched every lesson. I memorized every word on the chalkboard. When the children practiced writing, I observed how they formed letters. When they read aloud, I followed along in my mind. When they worked arithmetic problems, I solved them silently in my head. I was approximately 10 years old when the lessons began. By the time I was 14, I could read as well as the Morrison children. By 16, I could do arithmetic better than they could. By 18, I had educated myself through careful observation to a level that would have been illegal if the Morrisons had known I was learning. I also used my position in the house to learn about business and finance. Mr. Morrison kept account books in his study. When I cleaned his study, I would read those books. I learned how much the plantation earned from cotton sales, how much was spent on supplies, what debts were owed, how profits and losses were calculated. By the time I was 20 years old, in 1865, the year of emancipation, I understood the Morrison plantation's finances better than Mr. Morrison's own children did. I knew the plantation was profitable, but heavily in debt. I knew Mr. Morrison had borrowed extensively to maintain his lifestyle during the war years. I knew the plantation was vulnerable. When emancipation came in 1865, I was 20 years old. I could read, write, and calculate. I understood business and finance. I had knowledge that most formerly enslaved people didn't have. Knowledge I had gained specifically because my vitiligo had led to my assignment as a house servant. I immediately began planning how to use this knowledge to achieve not just freedom, but economic independence. For the first year after emancipation, 1865 to 1866, I worked as a paid domestic servant for various families in the area. I saved every penny I earned. I also continued to observe the Morrison plantation situation. I knew Mr. Morrison was struggling financially. The war had disrupted his markets, his debts had grown, and without enslaved labor, his costs had increased while his ability to profit had declined. In 1867, I took a job as a paid housekeeper for the Morrison family. This might seem strange, working for my former enslaver, but I had strategic reasons. The job paid better than other work available to me, and it gave me continued access to information about the plantation's finances. I worked for the Morrisons for 3 years, 1867 to 1870. During this time, I saved aggressively. I also continued to monitor the plantation's financial decline. Mr. Morrison's debts increased. Creditors began pressing for payment. I could see that bankruptcy was approaching. In early 1870, I learned that Mr. Morrison was being forced to sell property to pay debts. This was my opportunity. I had saved $800, an enormous sum for a formerly enslaved person, just 5 years after emancipation. But I had worked constantly and saved almost everything I earned. I approached Mr. Morrison and offered to purchase 200 acres, including the main plantation house, for $800. This was below market value, but Mr. Morrison needed cash immediately to avoid complete bankruptcy, and he had few buyers willing to pay cash quickly. Mr. Morrison was shocked that I, his former slave, a black woman, someone he had owned as property, was offering to buy his land. He initially refused, but his financial situation was desperate. After several weeks, he accepted my offer. In April 1870, I purchased 200 acres of the Morrison plantation, including the main house, for $800. The property transfer was recorded legally. I became the owner of land where I had been enslaved just 5 years earlier. The reversal was extraordinary. Mr. Morrison had owned me as property. Now I owned property that had been his. He had controlled every aspect of my life. Now I controlled land he had once controlled. Mr. Morrison and his family continued living on a small portion of the remaining property. Within a year, that too was sold to pay debts. The Morrison family became tenant farmers, eventually leaving the area entirely. I have now owned and operated the property for 5 years, since 1870. I have managed it successfully. I rent portions of the land to tenant farmers, both black and white. I have made improvements to the property. I have established myself as a landowner and businesswoman. I am giving this testimony because I want several things documented. First, I want the historical record to show that some formerly enslaved people achieved remarkable economic success during Reconstruction. I went from being enslaved to being a landowner in just 5 years. This was not common. Most formerly enslaved people faced enormous barriers to economic advancement, but it was possible for those who had specific advantages and who pursued strategic goals. Second, I want to document that my vitiligo, which in many ways was a burden, paradoxically created opportunities. Because of my distinctive appearance, I was assigned to household work, which gave me access to education and business knowledge that field workers didn't have. I used these advantages strategically. Third, I want to explain that my success was not luck. It was careful planning executed over many years. I began learning to read when I was 10 years old. I observed the Morrison family's finances for years. After emancipation, I worked constantly and saved aggressively. When opportunity came in 1870, I was ready with knowledge and resources. This was strategic economic planning carried out over 15 years. Fourth, I want people to understand that owning the plantation where I was enslaved has complex meaning. It represents economic success and a reversal of power. But it also means living on land where I experienced bondage, managing property where I was once property, and seeing places that hold difficult memories. Finally, I want to document that formerly enslaved people were capable of sophisticated economic thinking and planning. White Americans often believed that black people could not manage property or conduct business. My success, and the success of other formerly enslaved people who acquired land during Reconstruction, proves this belief was wrong. I am now 30 years old. I own 200 acres of productive land. I am economically independent. I achieved this through literacy gained by secretly observing lessons, knowledge gained by reading account books, strategic planning carried out over many years, and determined saving after emancipation. My vitiligo made me different, and being different created opportunities that I used strategically. The man who once owned me as property lost his property, partly because I was positioned to buy it when he needed to sell. That reversal demonstrates what was possible during Reconstruction for formerly enslaved people who had preparation, resources, and determination. Angela reads Rebecca's testimony multiple times. Struck by her clear strategic thinking, her careful planning over many years, and her sophisticated understanding of how her vitiligo had inadvertently created opportunities she had used to achieve extraordinary success. Angela contacts Dr. Marcus Thompson, a historian at the University of Georgia, who specializes in Reconstruction-era property acquisitions by formerly enslaved people, and the brief period when such acquisitions were possible before the gains of Reconstruction were systematically reversed. Marcus has spent decades researching cases of formerly enslaved people who acquired land and the strategies they used to achieve economic independence. Marcus calls her back immediately, his voice filled with excitement. Rebecca's case, if documentation confirms she purchased her former enslaver's plantation just 5 years after emancipation, would be one of the most dramatic reversals of power from Reconstruction that we have. Cases where formerly enslaved people acquired property from former enslavers are rare and extraordinarily significant. Send me everything. Angela shares all materials with Marcus. They arrange to meet at the Georgia Historical Society to examine property records, financial documentation, and any additional information about Rebecca and the Morrison plantation. Over the following weeks, Angela and Marcus verify Rebecca's story through property records and other documentation. They find the deed recorded in April 1870 showing Rebecca Freeman purchasing 200 acres, including improvements, the main house, from James Morrison for $800. They find tax records showing Rebecca paying property taxes continuously from 1870 onward, confirming sustained ownership. They find census records from 1870 listing Rebecca Freeman as a landowner, with property valued at $1,200. The land had appreciated slightly from her purchase price. The 1880 census shows her still owning the property, now valued at $1,500. They find that James Morrison's financial decline continued after the sale to Rebecca. By 1872, Morrison had lost all remaining property and left Georgia entirely. The reversal was complete. Rebecca owned the plantation. Morrison was landless. They also researched the broader context of vitiligo and how it affected enslaved people. They find scattered historical references suggesting that enslaved people with vitiligo were sometimes assigned to household work rather than field labor, possibly because their appearance was considered distinctive, or because enslavers had superstitious beliefs about the condition. This inadvertently gave some people with vitiligo access to education and information that field workers lacked. They find that Rebecca's success in purchasing her former enslaver's plantation was extremely rare, but not unique. During Reconstruction, particularly in the late 1860s and early 1870s, some formerly enslaved people acquired land from former enslavers through purchase, often when the enslavers faced financial difficulties. However, most of these acquisitions were small plots, not entire plantations including the main house. They trace what happened to Rebecca after 1875. From records, they find that she continued owning and managing the property until at least 1900. She married in 1878, but retained separate ownership of her property. She had 3 children. Census records show her as landowner and farmer through the end of the century. They find that Rebecca lost portions of the property during the 1890s, when discriminatory laws and economic pressures made it increasingly difficult for black landowners to maintain property. But she retained the core 80 acres, including the house, until her death in 1905, at age 60. Over the following months, Angela and Marcus worked to create an exhibition documenting Rebecca's extraordinary story, while also examining the broader context of Reconstruction-era land acquisition by formerly enslaved people, and why such successes became increasingly rare as Reconstruction ended. 26 months after Angela first opened that package, the Smithsonian opens the exhibition From Property to Property Owner, Rebecca Freeman's Reconstruction Triumph. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to examine Rebecca's story as both an individual achievement and as representative of the brief period when Reconstruction created opportunities for formerly enslaved people that were later systematically closed. The centerpiece is the 1875 photograph showing Rebecca with the vitiligo markings that had inadvertently shaped her path to success. Seated with quiet dignity, her distinctive appearance visible, but not defining her. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. Rebecca Freeman was born enslaved in Georgia in 1845 with vitiligo, causing distinctive depigmentation patches. Her appearance led to assignment as a house servant rather than field worker, giving her access to education. She secretly learned to read by observing lessons. After emancipation in 1865, she worked for wages while studying her former enslavers' failing finances. In 1870, just 5 years after freedom, she purchased 200 acres, including the main house of the Morrison Plantation, where she had been enslaved. paying $800. She became one of the rare formerly enslaved people to own the plantation where they had been property, demonstrating what strategic planning and reconstruction opportunities made possible. The exhibition tells Rebecca's complete story through her testimony, property records, financial documentation, and historical context about Reconstruction-era land acquisition. One section examines Rebecca's early life, her birth with vitiligo, how this condition led to household assignment, how she used that position to secretly learn to read and to study the plantation's finances, and how this preparation positioned her for post-emancipation success. Another section documents her strategic planning after emancipation, working for wages and saving aggressively, continuing to monitor Morrison's financial decline, positioning herself to make an offer when opportunity arose, and ultimately purchasing 200 acres in 1870. The exhibition includes the actual property deed from 1870, showing the transfer from James Morrison to Rebecca Freeman, making the reversal of ownership tangible and legally documented. A section on managing the reversal examines what it meant for Rebecca to own and operate the plantation where she had been enslaved, the complex emotions involved, the practical challenges of managing agricultural property, and the success she achieved as a landowner and businesswoman. The exhibition provides broader context about Reconstruction-era land acquisition, showing that while Rebecca's success was remarkable, other formerly enslaved people also acquired property during this period, and explaining why such acquisitions became increasingly difficult as Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow laws were implemented. A section on vitiligo provides medical information about the condition and examines how it affected enslaved people's experiences, including how distinctive appearance sometimes led to different work assignments that inadvertently created opportunities. The exhibition traces Rebecca's life after 1875, her continued ownership and management of the property, her marriage and children, the gradual loss of portions of property in the 1890s due to discriminatory pressures, and her retention of core property until her death in 1905. A video plays continuously, featuring historians discussing Rebecca's achievement, examining the brief Reconstruction period when such successes were possible, and reflecting on why the gains of Reconstruction were systematically reversed. On opening day, Angela stands watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study Rebecca's photograph, understanding that her distinctive appearance had inadvertently shaped a path to extraordinary success. Marcus stands beside her. Rebecca went from being enslaved to owning the plantation in just 5 years, he says quietly. That's an extraordinary reversal. But it was possible because she had specific advantages. Vitiligo led to household work, which gave access to education and business knowledge. She used every advantage strategically. She learned to read by age 14. She studied Morrison's finances for years. After emancipation, she saved aggressively while monitoring his decline. When opportunity came, she was ready. This wasn't luck. This was sophisticated planning, executed over 15 years. A young black woman with vitiligo approaches them after spending extensive time with the exhibition, emotion clear on her face. I have vitiligo, she says. I've always felt self-conscious about it, felt like it makes me different in negative ways. Reading about Rebecca, understanding that her vitiligo led to opportunities she used strategically, that she achieved extraordinary success, partly because her distinctive appearance gave her access to education. That's powerful. She didn't let her appearance define her or limit her. She used every advantage she had to achieve independence. An elderly black man stops to read Rebecca's testimony about the complexity of owning the plantation where she had been enslaved. Rebecca said owning the plantation had complex meaning. It represented economic success, but also meant living on land where she had experienced bondage, he says thoughtfully. That complexity is important. Her success was real, but it was achieved on land that held difficult memories. She managed that complexity while building a successful life. A historian examining the property records says, "The reversal is so complete and so well documented. In 1865, James Morrison owned Rebecca as property. In 1870, Rebecca owned property that had been Morrison's. The deed recording that transfer is a remarkable historical document. It literally records the reversal of ownership from enslaver to formerly enslaved person." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Rebecca's story represents both individual achievement and the brief Reconstruction period when such achievements were possible. As the museum prepares to close, Angela walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of Rebecca's photograph, looking at her calm, steady expression, at the vitiligo markings that had shaped her path. She thinks about Rebecca's life. Born enslaved in 1845 with vitiligo, assigned to household work because of her appearance, secretly learning to read from age 10 by observing lessons, studying the Morrison family's finances for years, gaining emancipation in 1865 at age 20, working and saving aggressively for 5 years while monitoring Morrison's decline, purchasing 200 acres in 1870 for $800, owning and managing the plantation successfully for 35 years, dying in 1905 at age 60, having proved that formerly enslaved people were capable of sophisticated business management and strategic economic planning. She thinks about the reversal, James Morrison owning Rebecca as property in 1865, Rebecca owning Morrison's property in 1870, Morrison losing everything and leaving Georgia while Rebecca prospered. And she thinks about how Rebecca's vitiligo, which could have been only a burden, had inadvertently created opportunities she had used with extraordinary strategic skill to achieve one of the most complete reversals of power documented from Reconstruction. The photograph waited 150 years to tell Rebecca's complete story. The image that shows a woman with distinctive vitiligo markings, seated with quiet dignity, has become testimony to strategic planning across years, to using every advantage to achieve independence, to one of the most dramatic reversals of power from Reconstruction, and to the brief period when formerly enslaved people could achieve successes that would later become nearly impossible. Now, the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose Rebecca would have wanted. Her story has been documented completely. Her strategic thinking has been recognized and honored. Her achievement of purchasing her former enslaver's plantation has been established as one of the most remarkable Reconstruction successes, and future generations can understand that some formerly enslaved people achieved extraordinary economic independence through careful planning, strategic use of advantages, and determination to build success despite all barriers. Rebecca Freeman, born enslaved with vitiligo in 1845, used her distinctive appearance's inadvertent advantages to gain education and knowledge, purchased her former enslaver's plantation in 1870, just 5 years after emancipation, successfully managed agricultural property for 35 years, and proved that formerly enslaved people were capable of sophisticated business achievement that white Americans claimed was impossible. Her story has been preserved as testimony to what was achievable during Reconstruction's brief window of opportunity, and as inspiration for understanding how individuals can use strategic planning and determination to achieve seemingly impossible reversals of fortune.